The J. Michael Show.
My guest today is Kathleen Marden. She is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, the famous couple that was abducted in the early 60s by a UFO, and she's the author of several books, including books on that and the subject of UFOs. Let's meet Kathleen. Kathleen, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Jay.
Yeah, so glad. So happy to have you as my guest. It's been a while. You were on my Conundrum show I used to have years ago. So it's great having you on the show, Kathleen.
Well, thank you. Great to be back.
Yeah. Well, what is your latest book?
It is Forbidden Knowledge, and it's number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's different than the first issue of Forbidden Knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the book. What does it cover?
It covers my life.
Mm-hmm.
The work that I've done, my life growing up in New Hampshire, my UFO experiences, my aunt Betty Hill, and the time I spent with her, and then why I became involved in this field, and all of the work that I've done in this field, the major findings that I've had over the years, the people I admired most, the people who helped me the most, some of my most significant investigations, and that sort of thing. Even an experiment that I did with an experiencer, Kevin Briggs, who claimed that he could communicate with extraterrestrials. And so a team of researchers gathered once a month at his home for a period of 2 years, and had the opportunity to meet these alleged non-humans and actually get scientific evidence.
Oh, wow.
That something was happening. There were orbs involved. There were craft involved. There was energy. There was communication with each of us. A lot of different things, including some weird activity, such as lost mail that I didn't know was lost, showing up on my nightstand, my husband's nightstand, and behind my toilet. And that never happens. Weird things like that. And weird things happen to all of us. Things moving on the kitchen counter, not on mine, but on other researchers. So there was this consciousness that was interacting with us. So we asked 120 questions and received answers about who they allegedly were and why they were here, messages about this planet, etc. So it was a very interesting experiment. And so it was some kind of consciousness. I don't know if it was extraterrestrials from another planet or precisely what it was, but there was definitely some consciousness there.
Wow.
They claimed to be an extraterrestrial council of 8, and along with them was a 9th dimensional healer who would have made 9, and also a 9th dimensional sort of head of this group, the person in charge.
Wow. Okay, well, just to refresh our audience's memory, who was Betty and Barney Hill and what happened to them?
Betty Hill was my aunt, my mother's oldest sister, and she was a social worker in the state of New Hampshire. I grew up seeing her very frequently, and I was actually born in the house next to where she lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, until my family built a house and moved across the street from my grandparents' house in Kingston. And that's where Betty grew up. And she married Barney. She'd known him for many years. They didn't intend to marry because he was black and she was white. And they thought this could lead to some problems, but they had similar intellectual interests, political interests, and they fell in love and decided that regardless of the consequences, they would marry in 1960. So he wanted her to move to Philadelphia because that's where he was living and that's where his sons were. But she insisted upon staying in New Hampshire with her family. So after about a little less than a year of marriage, he did end up moving to New Hampshire and had gotten a job. He worked for the post office. He'd been in the Army during World War II, then got a job with the post office as a truck driver, mail truck driver, and finally moved up, and they were happily married, doing their political activities, and had a lot of friends. And Pease Air Force Base was nearby, so they had friends from the base as well. And then it was in July or August of 1961 when they came to visit for a weekend. And I had been to Niagara Falls with my Aunt June, Betty's sister. And I was telling them all about Niagara Falls, the Maid of the Mist, and going under the falls, and what a great time I had. And I had photographs of it. And Betty said, Barney said to Betty, do you think you'd like to go there sometime? And she said that she would. So he decided to surprise her with a trip to Niagara Falls during her week's vacation as a social worker. So I've always felt a little bit responsible for what happened to them when they were returning home from this vacation.
You gave them the idea.
Yes, I gave them the idea.
And then they were on their way back, or they were going and they were abducted?
They had already gone to Niagara Falls and Montreal vacationing, and then it was time to return home. So they were driving home in upstate New Hampshire along Route 3 when this new light in the sky sort of came in. Instead of traveling like a conventional craft or a meteorite, it moved upwards in the air. And so Betty started to watch it as it grew larger and larger in the sky. And finally she asked Barney to stop the car so she could get a better look at this thing. She was wondering if it might have, been a satellite, but obviously that's not the way satellites fly.
Right.
And he finally did stop the vehicle. They got out, they looked at the craft, and it did shoot back toward Barney differently. It didn't circle like a plane does. It didn't move slowly. It just shot back at him. And he was sort of denying to Betty that it was what he knew it was.
Right.
And so, they left. They stopped in Franconia Notch, which is a beautiful scenic area in upstate New Hampshire. There are mountains on each side of the road. There's a stream that runs beside the road. And the craft was hovering fairly low, within 1,000 feet of them, through Franconia Notch. And they stopped at the Old Man of the Mountain, and its profile was 48 feet from forehead to the top of the head to the chin. It was like a natural rock formation, but it was New Hampshire's state symbol. Unfortunately, he fell off the mountain in 2003, but he'd been there for forever, since the formation. I guess the blasting from the new highway that was constructed, that was different than the road that Betty and Barney were on, might have dislodged some of his rocks. That was a big fear of people in the state, and there was a lot of resistance to building Route 93 through that area.
Right.
And but anyway, it was constructed, and they were later, and it fell from the mountain. But in 1961, they were on Route 3, which was a state highway.
And they were taken aboard this craft.
Yes, the craft finally swooped down over the highway just beside their car. Barney had to stop the car in the middle of the road so he wouldn't be directly under it. He jumped out of the car with binoculars, looked up at the craft. They later reported it to the Air Force, and in the Air Force report, it said that it was now the size of a dinner plate at arm's length. Keep in mind that the full moon is the size of an aspirin at arm's length.
Right.
So this was a huge craft.
Right.
And as Barney was looking at it, it shifted to the adjacent field. He turned and he walked to the edge of the field, and he was looking at it, and now it had descended even lower. It was probably 50 feet off the ground and 100 feet away from him, approximately, something like that. There were men looking down at him who were somehow not human, according to the early reports.
Right.
And to what he told my father. He described them to my father in that time frame.
And while they were on board, the aliens did a medical test on Betty, right? Tell me about that.
Yes, you're probably talking about the needle in the navel. They did many medical tests.
Right.
Unusual medical tests on Betty and Barney, taking many samples from their bodies.
Right.
And then they inserted a needle into Betty's navel. They had removed the dress. It fell to the floor. They broke the zipper in the process of removing it. And it caused great pain for Betty.
Yeah.
And the one who she called the leader removed the pain, and she began to trust him.
Interesting. And in your book, Captured, you covered the entire thing, everything that happened to them.
Everything. Not only what happened to them, but my years of investigation. I'm the trustee of their estate, so I had all of the original records. I didn't have to go after them, but I went after a lot more information. I did a full investigation of their case. This driving along their route during the same time frame, on the same roads, stopping in the same location that they stopped in. So we were on all the old roads, and just looking for a prosaic explanation for that 2 hours of missing time. And we just couldn't find it.
Yeah.
It was, and I also did a comparative analysis of their statements to Dr. Benjamin Simon under hypnosis, vis-a-vis a dream scenario. Betty had 5 dreams in which she dreamed that they saw the craft. They already knew that. That was already in the original reports. The description of the non-humans dressed in black, shiny uniforms was in the original report, written in September of 1961, just after they had the experience. What they couldn't remember was being on the craft. And so, boy, I did as much work as I could. I went to Philadelphia to the American Historical Museum down there. And Philip Klass, the debunker Philip Klass, and Carl Sagan and Donald Menzel, Dr. Donald Menzel, all of the big debunkers and disinformants have archival collections at the American Philosophical Society. I'm sorry, I said historical before. It's the American Philosophical Society. And I believe that Philip Klass's collection was there because he was very good buddies with all of the other of the scientists who were there.
Yeah.
Had collections there. And Dr. Donald Menzel was on the board of directors. And he was also closely associated with the CIA, the NSA, and who had been a professor at Harvard, astrophysics professors, and became close friends and worked together with Philip Klass in all of this debunking.
Right.
Philip had been in trouble with the FBI and the CIA earlier, and he was under suspicion of being a spy. And I have his FBI file, so that's the reason I know this. So I know his history of having a relationship with a young man at the Soviet embassy and being followed and having his apartment searched for radio equipment that could broadcast into East Europe and that kind of thing. Wow. So he had also gotten into trouble for revealing classified information in 2 articles that he wrote in Space and Technology magazine, where he worked. And then after that, just about 1966, is when he suddenly became very interested in UFOs. And he read his first books, The Interrupted Journey, and the first one was Incident at Exeter. Right. And apparently those 2 books made him an expert in the field, and he got into contact with Edward Condon, who was the head of the scientific study on UFOs funded by the Air Force, which ended up ending Project Blue Book. But Philip Klass was very much involved in that project, and with project manager Robert Lowe. And
he was a debunker. He was basically
definitely
working for the government, apparently.
Yes.
Yeah, to
yes.
debunk UFOs. You know, recently we have changed the name from UFO to UAP. Why?
Yes.
Why do you believe that the government did that?
Well, UFO is unidentified flying object. Mm-hmm. Well, UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena.
Right.
So phenomena can be anything. So they're talking about orbs, more than something that's material. They're and we know that orbs are associated, like these plasma orbs show up in the homes of most experiencers of ET contact or alien abduction. That's the way they come in and they take people through this beam. That's, it looks like a laser beam. I have photographs of it from one of my cases.
Wow.
And these ETs appear as orbs inside the beam. And then when they come into our environment, they might become grays. They might become 3-dimensional, like us. And the people that I've worked with in hypnosis and historically from reading other hypnotist reports, people feel like they're coming apart when they're in this sort of carrier beam.
Like a transporter that they're being disassembled and reassembled.
Yes, sort of like they become orbs, and then they're reassembled into humans again when they are aboard this craft, because we know that they're doing testing on us. And I don't think that we're orbs when we're up there, if they're able to test our bodies. Some people say it's only our etheric bodies that are there, that it's not our physical bodies. But people come back with marks on their physical bodies.
Yeah.
Surgical marks, puncture wounds, scoop marks, triangular shaped marks, all sorts of marks
Well, let
on
me
their
ask you
bodies.
another question, and would be from Forbidden Knowledge. It says a personal journey from alien abduction to spiritual transformation. In your opinion, what are UFOs? What are they? Are
Well,
they non-corporeal? Are they physical craft?
they're physical craft, but they can be non-corporeal. Their physics is far in advance of our physics. We'll probably be there someday. I've talked to physicists about this. I say, how can they possibly come through our roofs or through solid surfaces in our homes and take us out? They can open these portals
Right.
into our environment. How can they do that? And the physicists say, remember, 99.9% of the atom is empty space.
Huh.
And all you have to do is align frequency and phase, and atoms can interpenetrate. So if they can align their frequency and our frequency
Right.
and phase, then those atoms can interpenetrate. And I'm not a physicist. I took a physics class in high school.
Right.
It was Stanton Friedman who I worked with for many years, who was the nuclear physicist. But
Right.
Dr. Rudy Shield is one of the physicists that I talked to about this, and he was an astrophysicist at Harvard. And also there were others, Dr. Claude Swanson, who was an astrophysicist and wrote books, very thick books, on the science of the paranormal and the science of UFOs, and to help us to understand
Right.
what is going on, to the best of his knowledge. And he was a brilliant man, and advanced physicist.
So do you think that they're using technology to do this, or they're using their own minds to do it?
I believe that they're using technology.
So it's
That's
some
what I believe.
advanced technology.
A highly advanced technology
Wow.
that can cause them to appear to be interdimensional.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to understand.
Right.
I'll be the first to admit that I might be wrong on this, but I do speak to physicists, and I watch shows with some of the newer spokespersons who have been military officers, military officers who have been taken to craft, scientists such as Gary Nolan, who have worked on this, attempting to solve the question
Right.
regarding the physical impact of all of this on humans. And so I do listen to a lot of different shows that are to me
Right.
by people who really know what they're talking about and have the credentials.
Right.
I have, I feel like I know as much as I could possibly find out, given my level of education and knowledge and personal experience.
Right.
But these people are really probing very deeply into all of this, and they believe that at least some of them believe that this has a physical component, but it is also appears to be interdimensional. The level
Yeah.
of physics, it's our physics, but it's so beyond what we know.
You mentioned earlier that you worked with Stanton Friedman. How did you meet him?
I met him many, many years ago. I believe it was in 1971 or 1972 when he spoke at the University of New Hampshire, and where I went and to his lecture on UFOs are real. And I think that that's the first time. And then, of course, he was the scientist who found other scientists who could vet the work of Marjorie Fish, who had spent years attempting to identify the stars on the star map that my aunt saw when she was on craft. And Marjorie was a brilliant woman. It took her years, but finally we developed the technology for that gave us better distance data on the stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 light years. And she was able to find a match. And this is when Stanton accepted her request to find astrophysicists who would be willing to vet her work for accuracy.
Right.
And he did find some, and they said that her work was accurate. So that's how I met Stanton. I asked him if he might be interested in contributing to my book that I had been writing for many years, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. And this was after Betty's death in 2004.
Right.
And we talked in 2005. We did a television show together and talked some more. And then we talked some more at the MUFON International Symposium in 2005. And I think by that time, he had become interested in seeing what I had, because as the trustee of Betty's estate, I had all of her files.
You also had the dress she wore that night.
I had the dress.
Yeah.
I had all of the artifacts, which I ended up giving to the University of New Hampshire. I was, as the executrix, in charge of selecting the files that I thought should go to UNH, and the evidence that I thought should go to an archival collection there. But before I donated anything, Stanton came down and he spent some time with my husband and myself and went through the files, and I permitted him to photocopy anything that he wanted
Right.
to take back to New Brunswick with him. And I imagine that some of that is in his archival collection in New Brunswick now. And so we talked and talked. And at the end of all of this, he told me that he would join me and the reason for that is that he said my work was scientific and unbiased.
Right. Exactly.
And we worked together well because he was the physical scientist and I was the social scientist. So it was a perfect team in a sense.
Yeah.
And he, of course, had been in the field longer than I had. He'd been, he was world famous. And I was relatively unknown because I had been holding back. I'd been working in the field. I was a MUFON member, an investigator. I was the director of field investigator training way back in the 90s. Yeah. I was writing articles and contributed to a book back in like 1991 on Betty and Barney, but I hadn't done a lot of work on television or radio shows in that time frame. I was raising 5 children, and I had worked as an educator while I was doing all of this work. But, finally Stanton and I were working together, and he wrote a couple of chapters for my book. He vetted my work for accuracy, as did Linda Moulton Howe and Dr. Bruce Maccabee. And so Stanton and I discovered that we worked so well together that we decided to write an additional 2 books together. Wow. So I have like 7 books, and 3 of those were with Stanton.
Getting back to the dress, was there any physical evidence on the dress that
Oh,
indicated something strange had happened?
there was a lot of physical evidence on the dress. The first scientific analysis was very, very lengthy. It was done during the 1970s at the University of Cincinnati, the chemistry department there. And they could not produce the results using all sorts of chemicals and bleaching agents and infrared light. They could not produce the results of that pink powdery substance, nor could they find spores to indicate that it was fungus that had grown on the dress. So that was very interesting. There were several additional tests. Phyllis Budinger, who had a master's degree in organic chemistry and worked for BP Amoco, formerly Standard Oil, for 35 years as an analytical chemist, did an extensive analysis on Betty's dress and still couldn't identify that pink powder, but said that what she did find on the dress was consistent with what Betty said happened to her on the craft. There have been many more. There's been a DNA analysis fairly recently. I was up at the University of New Hampshire working on a show where Ben Hansen was the producer, sort of the person who interviewed me at the University of New Hampshire. And we very carefully looked at the dress. And he used to work for the FBI. And so he did a great job, I have to say, taking a look at that dress. He turned it wrong side out. And I had already given Phyllis Budinger samples from the back of the dress. But Ben was very interested in an area of staining on the dress that looked like blood, and they were in the area of Betty's navel. And so he then turned the dress right side out. He looked at the fabric. Those stains did not come from the outside. Betty had not spilled something on the dress.
Right.
And he said, could this be blood, showing that the needle in the navel that Betty reported was actually true? Is this scientific evidence? And so I had a blood sample from Betty. I sent that to the scientists, the biological scientists, and I cut the sample from that area of the dress. I'm the only one who can do the cutting. And I sent it to the laboratory, and unfortunately, Betty's blood sample and the sample on the dress were too old to determine whether or not it was blood.
Right.
However, both showed Betty's DNA. So it could be evidence that Betty's memory of having a needle inserted into her navel was true and real, that it wasn't some kind of imaginary thing.
Wow.
Also, the front of Betty's, I think it was the front and maybe the area near the zipper in the back, I sent to University of Pittsburgh. And there was an analysis done at the University of Pittsburgh chemistry department. And they found very rare and expensive elements on Betty's dress, some of the rarest elements on Earth.
Wow.
That are used now in nanotechnology. Which
goodness.
is just amazing. I mean, this could be the smoking gun.
Right. That is fascinating. And at what point did you get involved with MUFON, with all of this that you had?
I became involved in MUFON in 1991 because I wanted to do the formal training to become a UFO investigator. And so I did that was an investigator. Then I said I was for 10 years, I was the director of field investigator training. I wrote with Denise Stoner and a team of consultants the protocols on how to investigate a UFO abduction. And then I was the founder of MUFON's experiencer research team. And that began in 2011. And so I was the director and founder of that team. We began with 3 people, and we ended up with, when I left, or I stepped down as director because my husband was ill, and I needed to run the family business and take care of him. That was in 2021. But I remained with the organization. I'm a benefactor to the organization, and I'm a consultant to the ERT now. It's now called the Experiencer Resource Team. But when I was director, we did a major study on 516 experiencers of contact, all who qualified as abductees. We did this with Dr. Don C. Donderi from McGill University, a psychologist, research psychologist, who had worked with Bud Hopkins as well. And very lucky to have him taking part in this study with us. He did phase 2 of the study, where he had, with Bud Hopkins, developed a test called the American Personality Inventory, which determined whether a person had UFO abduction syndrome. And so we were able to acquire a lot of information from these 516 participants. Some of them had all of the symptoms of UFO abduction syndrome, and others had not all of them, but still were not wannabes or hoaxers.
Right.
They were all abductees or ET contactees.
Right. Working with all of these scientists and accredited people, how do you deal with misinformation when it's out there? Or do you run across a lot of that?
I only deal with misinformation when it pertains to my own work or work about Betty and Barney, misinformation concerning Betty and Barney. I don't deal with the disinformants, the debunkers. I used to, but they probably know the truth and they have a job, or just they want to be, become famous off my back,
Right.
that kind of thing. And so I don't even bother with them because I know what their game is, and I'm not interested in playing that game. But if it's somebody I respect and they make an incorrect statement, I just contact them and let them know. I don't make a big deal out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, because there is a lot of, a lot of misinformation out there. And in today's world, with our current CGI and AI technology, there's a lot of fake things out there, too. Do you have to ever deal with that?
I don't deal with that. No, I don't. There are photo analysts who can deal with that. I've had some very good cases where we had photographic evidence that I've had photo analysts look at and verified that it was not CGI, that kind of thing. Those were only three cases out of years of work where there was actually good, clear photographic evidence.
Wow. On the
video.
night that the UFO encounter happened to Betty and Barney Hill, was there any corroborating witnesses, sightings, or something other people saw as well as what they saw?
To date, we found, I believe it's 17 witnesses.
Wow.
John Luttrell, who broke the story as the result of a violation of confidentiality by one of Betty's friends, He was a renowned newspaper reporter. He received awards for his work for the Boston Traveler. And he did his own investigation. Betty and Barney refused to talk to him or to cooperate with him. But when he wrote his articles, had already found 6 witnesses. By the time the 70s rolled around, this was 1965 when he wrote the articles. By the time the 70s rolled around, Stanton Friedman wrote to him asking him if he had found additional witnesses. By that time, he said there were 12 to 14 that he remembered, and that they were all in different locations that night. And so he had drawn on a map where they were, and then where Betty and Barney and the craft were, at what time. And then he drew lines between their location and Betty and Barney and the craft, and all of the lines intersected.
Right.
And then after that, there was a truck driver who was driving that night who contacted Betty and said he had seen the craft too. I overheard that conversation. Then there were 2 servicemen who were together that night who contacted me much, much later. This is after Betty had already passed away, when they contacted me to report that they had seen the craft that night as well.
Wow. That is amazing. You said that you've written 7 books on the subject of UFOs. What are they, and where can we find them?
You can find them on my website at Kathleen-Marden.com. They're also available on Amazon, but if you want to go to look to see what they are, just go to my website. If you didn't get that, Kathleen-Marden.com, just Google my name. I'll come up and you'll find them. But I had captured, then Science Was Wrong with Stanton, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers with Stanton, The Alien Abduction Files with Denise Stoner. I covered her story in the book and wrote most of the book, but she wrote about her own personal experiences too, which is about a third of the book.
Yeah.
And fascinating UFO abduction. Reminded me of Betty and Barney because she and her husband and daughter were traveling that night, that they were taken, and there was so much evidence and witnesses. But she's a lifelong experiencer as well, dating back to her parents being taken, and then her being taken when she was about two and a half years old. And
is this common that a person is abducted, but you find out that their parents and maybe even their grandparents were abducted also?
Yes. In our studies, we discovered that intergenerational contact is very frequent. And I believe that it is for the proximity of the genetic line, so that the ET masters of genetics can look for changes in the DNA in their experiments to upgrade us.
Upgrade us? What do you mean by that?
They want to see us advance as a species, and they're attempting to upgrade our DNA so that we will become more telepathic, more psychic, develop abilities that we don't have, become less primitive than we are now. We have some very primitive emotions that could lead to the destruction of our planet. They're very concerned about that, they say. They've told many, many people, including the researchers who took part in the experiment that I mentioned earlier with Kevin Briggs, and wrote about in Forbidden Knowledge. So I had the Forbidden Knowledge 1 and 2, and also extraterrestrial contact, what to do when you've been abducted. And that's a book that we wrote, some members of the ERT, and I wrote for experiencers, abductees. Some of my best cases are in that book, but also we wrote it to help experiencers or abductees work through any trauma they might be experiencing, for people to know what experiencers have in common, how experiencers evolve over time,
Right.
how to overcome your any trauma that you might experience as a result
Right.
of contact, and on and on and on. How suggestions on how to make it end if you want it to end. So that's extraterrestrial contact. What to do if you've been abducted.
Do you believe that you have been abducted?
Well, I have quite a bit of evidence that I have been. Yes.
Oh, tell me about it. Tell me about what you found.
I don't like to talk about it, but I did write about some of it in Forbidden Knowledge. And what I will say is, when I was 17 years old, my Aunt Betty Hill was doing an experiment with a team of scientists attempting to call craft in to land on my grandparents' farm. I grew up across the street from my grandparents. And one night, a craft did come in. There were two people who observed it coming in, looking as if it was going to land. My mother and I remembered being taken to craft. That was part of our conscious recall. There was physiological evidence that something had happened to us. We made a confidential report on this years later when we met Dr. James Harder, who was working for APRO and came to visit my Aunt Betty Hill. I thought that I was never going to ever tell anybody.
Right.
But, well, I decided to spill the beans a few years ago, not to say a whole lot about it, but I was talked into stating this in order to help other experiencers. People convinced me that I should let people know. And I hope that it has helped. It certainly hasn't helped me. But I hope that it has helped others.
Well, I'm not going to press you on any more information about it. But obviously, being abducted is a traumatic experience.
It was.
Yeah. So let's move on to this. You have a movie coming out called A Greater Reality, a film?
Yes.
Tell me about it.
I'm in this film as an on-camera expert and member of the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research on Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters. So Ray Hernandez and Kevin and Helene Lane are producing this movie about Ray's life and his experience with ET contact. And then he's bringing all of us. I was a member of Free. I was on the board of directors. I think I was the chairperson of the board of directors of that. I worked on the academic study with Free scientists and Ray Hernandez and others. So all of us who were involved in all of this are in this movie. So many, many people testifying about Kevin Briggs, who I spoke of, is in this movie. Denise Stoner, who I spoke of, is in there. I hypnotized her on camera, and she spoke about her experience. So many, many experiencers of contact and on-camera experts. I've been on, this makes 62 television productions and motion pictures I've appeared on. And
Do you know when it's going to come out to the public?
fairly soon, I think within a couple of months, they're putting the final touches on it.
Uh-huh. Great.
So they've been tied up with another movie. These are big producers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to get this out soon. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah. And do you know where it will be? Netflix or where?
It's going to be on one of those online or platforms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if it's Netflix or where it's going to be.
Yeah.
I
but
don't
you'll
have
be
that
able to-
information.
You'll definitely be able to watch it.
Yes, and they did put the trailer out. So if you go to my website, I think you can find the link to the trailer.
Okay.
And I know if you go to Ray Hernandez's site on Facebook,
Okay.
Renario Hernandez or Ray Hernandez, then you'll be able to see the trailer.
And
too.
it's called A Greater Reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I-
going to be a great movie.
I can't wait for that. Well, we've covered a lot today, and there's so much more. I mean, there's way more we could go into. You have 7 books. We could talk about each one. Is there anything that we did not talk about that you want to make sure that is said on this show today?
No,
No,
I think we've covered enough.
we covered everything.
Yes, we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Of course, we haven't covered everything, but we can do another show.
Yeah, we can always have
We
you
can
back
cover
and do
more.
another show this season. I am so happy, so proud to get to talk to you again. It's been a while. And
Great to talk to you.
yeah, good luck with all of your future books. We'll put links under here to your website and where everyone can find this stuff.
Okay,
But thank you so much for being a guest on my show.
and thank you. It was a pleasure.
Goodbye.